Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you the image quality breakdown that many of you have been looking for, and that is to Tamron's new 17-35mm F2.8 to F4 OSD lens. A lot of you, of course, like the size and the price and the basics of this lens, but does it hold up optically? And our first look, we took a look at this lens and saw a lot of positive things about it. But in this episode today, we're going to dive deep into the image quality itself and see if this is really a worthwhile option for you if you are looking for an inexpensive wide-angle option for your full-frame camera. And so let's jump in and let's take a look. All right, we'll start off by taking a look at the raw image right out of the camera, uncorrected versus one that's been run through the standard profile to see how things clean up in post. And so as you can see, the lens definitely has some noticeable barrel distortion and a fairly heavy vignette wide open. And so, however, looking at it, we see that it actually corrects really nice and clean. And so the distortion pattern here is it's fairly linear, and so there's no like mustache type distortion. And so not a major issue if you're shooting raw files for cleaning up in post. However, if you're shooting JPEGs, because you're not getting any in-camera correction, you will end up with some noticeable barrel distortion and vignette. So let's take a look at how the vignette naturally clears up. So here we are at f2.8. If we move on to f4, you see a fairly significant lift really across a good portion of the frame. Moving on to f5.6, you see a little bit of lift in the corners. And then at f8, there's really not much of a noticeable difference. And so by f5.6, it is naturally cleared up, which is pretty typical. So we'll take a look at the resolution. In the center of the frame, we can see at 17 millimeters, we have got a good amount of wide open contrast and sharpness. Very nice center of the frame performance. If we move off to the edge, obviously we are competing with pretty heavy vignette, but at the same time you can also see that we have got a good amount of resolution really going right out to the very edge of the frame. We can also see that we're getting a fairly equal performance on both sides of the frame, so centering is not bad. But look at this, I mean, this is right off near the edge of the frame, and you can see, beyond where the vignette is, that you really are getting a really fantastic looking amount of sharpness and resolution. I would say in the very extreme corners, you've got some softness creeping in at f2.8, but really this is a pretty sharp lens wide open. So if we can compare f2.8 to f4 at 17 millimeters, we see that the center of the frame, there may be a mild amount of improvement, but it's really not all that significantly different. What we do see, if anything, is that you've got a little bit maybe more consistent illumination across the frame. Light transmission, I think, has improved, stopping down a little bit. Likewise, looking off of the edge of the frame, vignette lift, I would say, is the biggest optical improvement. I mean, you can see the edges better, but I don't know that there are a whole lot sharper per se. And it seems to me that the sharpness fall off. It's maybe a little closer out to the edge of the frame, but it's not radically different either at f4. And so still in the extreme corners, we have a bit of softness in the extreme corners. It's mostly vignette lift that's improvement. So if we go from f4 to f5.6, again, we see basically a similar pattern as before. It seems like the lens kind of gets its stride in terms of light transmission and obviously a more even illumination across the whole frame. We do see a bit more sharpness into the very edge of the frame, but it's only in that last little nth of a degree. And so now I would say, you're pretty close to being sharp corner to corner, I would say here, and with the vignette lift, you're getting quite a good sharpness result across the frame, but it's more about degrees more than anything. It's not like we've seen a huge significant jump up, because really wide open sharpness was quite good. Now if we jump to 20 millimeters, let's take a look at what we see here. We can see that on the right side, this is the uncorrected side, we can see that there is still some lingering barrel distortion and certainly still some significant vignette, quite heavy. That seems to be the biggest optical weakness of this lens, is its vignette. However, looking beyond that, we can see that once again it corrects cleanly, and so you end up with a good result after the profile is attached. Now, while this isn't an apples to apples comparison, not of the same wall, not at the same time, it is a similar enough with the new G2 lens that you can get a sense of the strengths and weaknesses as compared. And so what we can see is that the G2 is definitely superior when it comes to vignette. This is an uncorrected raw image here, and it also has less barrel distortion at 20 millimeters. And so the advantage there, I would say, is that. Now, looking at the center sharpness and contrast, I would say that there's not a significant amount of difference. And if we look off at the side of the frame, obviously the G2 looks better because it has so much less vignette. But if you can look kind of past the vignette, the actual resolution profile is not significantly different between these two lenses. And at 20 millimeters, the 17-35 is still holding f2.8, and so that's a positive there. So if we compare the f2.8 to the f4, again we're at 20 millimeters, we can see that there's a more rapid lift of that vignette here at f4, and so you're getting a much more even looking illumination. Beyond that, however, I mean, once again, the lens is very, very sharp, wide open. And so what you're seeing here is better light transmission. So a little bit more even result, but it's not it's not a significant difference in the actual resolution or contrast. Those are already quite good, wide open. And what we're seeing here is that at 20 millimeters, it's really continuing right off into the corners better than what it did at 17 millimeters. And so what you're seeing is a very, very little difference in terms of contrast and resolution. What you're mostly seeing is a more even illumination due to the vignette lift. Comparing f4 to f5.6, a much less radical difference here, once again, because already the vignette lift has pretty much been accomplished. And so in terms of our center resolution, let's go down to the bottom of the frame for something different. They look pretty much identical to me. So I would say that at f4, other than maybe in this very, very, very edge, you're getting pretty much the same performance at f4 as you would stopping down further. So if we move on to 24 millimeters, the first thing to note is that now maximum aperture is f3.2. This is a variable aperture zoom. I'm encouraged by the fact, however, that we are already a pretty good ways through the actual zoom range, and we've only lost 1/3 stop of light transmission, or at least aperture value. And so that certainly is a positive. I've seen a lot of variable aperture zoom lenses that, kind of ramp through their larger maximum apertures really, really quick and get to the small ones quickly. That isn't the case here, so positive there. We see a similar pattern, however, when we compare the uncorrected to the corrected raw image. What we see is that a very heavy vignette that covers a good portion of the frame. However, now at 24 millimeters, distortion is pretty much a non-issue. And so there's neither really any barrel or pincushion distortion, so not a lot to correct other than vignette. Now, if we look at the f4 image, we see that once again, most of that vignette has cleared up already. We'll take a look at our resolution profile. So what we're seeing is that once again, I mean, the center of the frame looks pretty much identical from f2.8 to f4. On the edge of the frame, once again, it's obscured somewhat by the heavy vignette, but what we're seeing is a nearly identical result out in the edges of the frame, that really the resolution and the contrast is already actually very, very good across the frame, wide open, 24 millimeters f3.2. It's mostly the vignette lift that has made a difference. Stopping on down to f5.6 makes an extremely negligible difference in the vignette, and what we can see is that once again, That's also true in terms of resolution. So, I mean, the great news here is that you can stop down to help to lift a vignette if that's a concern for you. But at the same time, you can pretty much choose whatever aperture value you want, even for shooting a landscape. And at, you know, once we've gotten past 17 millimeters, it's really sharp from corner to corner, really wide open. So going on to the very end of the focal range, in between 24 millimeters and 35 millimeters, you'll first go to f3.5 and then eventually arrive at f4. And so at the end of the focal range, maximum aperture is f4. Still a fairly heavy vignette, maybe not as bad as what we've seen at other focal lengths, but heavy, no doubt about it. A very mild amount of pin cushion distortion, which we can see corrects just fine once again with the standard profile. So if you're shooting RAWs and you're going into post, there is distortion, but it all corrects very cleanly and non-destructively. So now at 35 millimeters, you know, we're starting at f4, so our first stop down is actually at f5.6. So we'll look at comparing these. Once again, biggest thing that's happened, vignette is lifted. Center performance looks fantastic, wide open, looks good at f5.6 obviously as well, but not really any different. And the same is true here of our edge performance. Already at f4, you have sharpness that goes from corner to corner, and what you're mostly getting stopping the lens down is just some vignette lift. Now in a landscape type situation, this is an uncorrected result. It's with actual landscapes, it would be a different story if you're shooting, you know, architecture, something with straight lines. But out in nature, it is somewhat more difficult to see either the distortion and really the vignette. I mean, you can tell it's there in the corners, but of course it provides a more natural looking result. At f4, we've seen a lot of vignette lift. And so let's take a look at how it resolves, however, out at infinity. And so center of the frame, this is on a 30 megapixel Canon 5D Mark IV. It looks great. I mean, center of the frame looks fantastic. Lots of detail, lots of resolution. And again, what we see more than anything, if you'll look at this trunk compared to here, what you mostly see as an improvement is what I would consider a little better contrast that is due more than anything to improved light transmission, as that vignette and some of that veiling in terms of some darkness across the frame. Now off to the edge of the frame, you can obviously see more of the texture show up because of the reduced vignette. And so, you know, f4 is obviously better than f2.8 for that reason. But, you know, really resolution-wise, it's only a moderate improvement because resolution is actually really, really good from this lens wide open. So now skipping on to 24 millimeters wide open, which is f3.2, center resolution is really stunningly good. I mean, that looks fantastic. And again, f4, it's brighter, it's giving you better light transmission. But it already looked fantastic, and so it just looks, you know, equally fantastic with the lens stopped down a little bit. Off the edge of the frame, your biggest advantage once again is vignette lift that allows those textures to stand up. But I mean, the lens really is fantastic at landscape apertures, really, really sharp. Now let me give you a real world. This is a handheld result, and this is at 17 millimeters. I'm going to show you both the focal range and how it, you know, actually handles for shooting real, you know, typical landscapes. This is at f5.6. And so as we can see, I mean, detail is really quite fantastic all across the frame. I mean, look at all of that. Contrast is great. I mean, its color rendition is very good. It's a great looking image. And that is courtesy of that at 17 millimeters. And now if we skip on to 35 millimeters, that shows you the zoom range there. And so, and what we can see here is similarly a lot of really good resolution. I would say that here at 35 millimeters, it's a hair weaker than in the middle of the focal range. And stop down to a landscape aperture, I would say that it is stronger throughout other portions of the range, but this still looks very, very good at a landscape aperture, and so certainly a useful focal range as well. Here's another 17 millimeter f5.6 handheld landscape type shot. And so looking towards the center of the frame, I mean, yeah, lots and lots of detail. get all in right off to the edge of the frame. These are Tamaracks. You can see all of the needles that are really finely rendered there. Just, great looking stuff, and, great color rendition. It's a very, very useful and light landscape lens if you're looking for a very portable option. Here's another shot that I captured some really unique light, kind of cloud cover, but sun as it was rising was coming underneath there and illuminating the tops of the trees. But I mostly just wanted to show you this to show you that the lens, it really handles landscape type images quite well. One thing you can see looking at this image, or you can look at this upper portion here as well. These are areas where lateral chromatic aberration would show up, which is something that Tamron's 15-30mm f2.8 zooms do suffer with. This lens does not seem to have any kind of issue really with chromatic aberrations of any kind. They're quite well controlled. Now, this lens is not going to be a big bokeh producer. I mean, it's f4 at 35 millimeters and, has only a moderately good magnification figure of 0.20. Useful. Let's just see how it, resolves there. This is, again, this is a handheld image, but we can see that detail is really quite good there at minimum focus, and you can see a little bit of how it handles some defocus area here. And, doesn't look too bad, really. Now, I used the lens here kind of in a situation where the 15-30mm lenses suffer a bit, and that's where the sun is kind of coming at an angle throughout the frame. Here at f2.8, we can see that there's not any kind of major issue. There's some localized veiling that's there. That's never really a serious issue. We've got a little ghosting artifact, so this would be the axis that the sun is coming down. Nothing major over here, so it's actually better as far as that side flare metric than the 15-30mm lenses, which is not surprising because this has more of a flat front element and it doesn't have that bulbous front element like those lenses do. So with the sun more head on, what we're finding here is that it's actually a little bit more vulnerable to some flare than what the other lenses, the 15-30mm lenses, are in this situation. And so what we can see is there is some a ghosting type pattern along there on the edge. This is at f2.8. When the lenses stop down, it becomes a little bit more pronounced, if not as extensive. We also see a ghosting artifact here in the corner. That one kind of clears up at f11. However, what we do see is that the actual sun rays become a little bit more pronounced. There's a little ghosting artifact there that stays pretty much the same. It's larger here at f2.8. It's a little bit brighter at f11. And so, at the end of the day, however, it's still not terribly destructive. If this represents worst case scenario, it's not all that incredibly bad. So how about for astro? This lens is actually a surprisingly appealing option for the simple reason that at 17mm it has a maximum aperture of f2.8, or really all the way up through at least 24mm. And so you've got a lot of options where you have a fairly good maximum aperture. There is one vulnerability for shooting astro that we'll discuss in a moment, but first let's take a look for chroma here. So what we can see is that we've got lots of star points that have shown up here. Again, this was not a very good night in terms of conditions, and so I had to kind of fight to get a decent result here. But despite, you can still see there's a bit of haze that's over these these textures, and that's due to there actually was some overcast here. But it's picked up lots of star points, and if we look along the edge of the frame, there really is, chroma is actually quite well controlled. There's a little bit of distortion, stretching of stars in the very corners, but in terms of chroma, it's really, really not there. I mean, no wings or anything, and so, a surprisingly strong result there. So I did mention that there is an issue for shooting night sky, just for you to be aware of. And one reason why, if you're really more of an astro shooter, the 15-30mm might be a better option. And that, of course, is the heavy vignette. That vignette, as we saw, it clears up nicely when you're shooting at more moderate ISO values. But of course, at higher ISO values, like you're using at night, you can clean it up, as I have done here by applying the standard profile. But you do that at the risk of creating some noise. And as we can see here, there's even a little bit of actually some discoloration, some banding that's shown up there, and that is on the 5D Mark IV, which at the moment is Canon's best body for shooting under these circumstances. And so just be aware that you can leave an image like this, and but you're going to lose some of your stars in the corner. You can see that how there's not a whole lot of stars showing up here, and there is more of them showing up after we have lifted up the corners, but you're doing that maybe at the cost of introducing some destruction into the edges of the image from the vignette correction. So as you can see, outside of basically 2 exceptions, this lens does pretty much everything well. At wide angles, it does have some distortion, some fairly strong barrel distortion, but that is mitigated somewhat by the fact that the profile clears it up really nicely because it is a linear distortion and it isn't inconsistent, a mustache type pattern. And so profile clears that up nicely if you're shooting raw images. The other issue can be a little bit more of a factor. It does have a fairly heavy vignette, and I suspect that's some of the trade-off of not having that curved front element. And I noted, for example, that Canon's new 16-35mm F2.8L Mark III, it has incredibly heavy vignette as well. And so certainly a liability maybe with some of these lenses, and so that to me is the single biggest factor. And we saw how depending on your situation and the ISO value you're shooting in, that may actually cause a bit of destruction to correct it along the edges of the frame. But beyond that, the lens is actually incredibly sharp at all of the tested focal lengths, and it's very, very sharp in the center, has great contrast, and then stopping it down makes a little bit of difference at 17mm and maybe at 35mm. Throughout most of the focal range, however, it's already, almost optimally sharp across the frame from maximum aperture on. Another positive we saw is that it does hold on to those maximum apertures, the wider ones, for a fairly good portion of the focal range, and so that's also a plus to me, that you actually are getting a wider than competing maximum aperture throughout a good portion of that focal range. So a plus there. And of course it did do, other than the vignette, it did a really good job in handling the coma, and so also handles lateral and longitudinal chromatic aberration well. A lot of good stuff going on there. So stay tuned. I'll be back with my final verdict. I'll give you a little bit of feedback how the autofocus system works, also how it handles if you throw it onto an adapter, say on the new EOS R or a Sony body, and to give you some feedback on how it works there as well. So stay tuned for that final verdict, and I'll be back shortly with it. In the meantime, take a look in the description down below. I've got links to an image gallery with a lot of great looking images there that you can go and check out for yourself. And also there's buying links if you'd like to purchase one from a number of retailers. And beyond that, there are also options to follow me on social media, become a patron, sign up for my newsletter, and of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.